The University of the Western Cape is celebrating 60 years of hope to action through knowledge by hosting a 60-for-60 Golf Fundraiser Challenge to support the education and development of 60 deserving UWC students. Show your support by entering a 4-ball or by contributing to a watering hole and prizes. Tee-off is at 11 a.m. on Thursday, 12 November at the King David Golf Club in Mowbray. Contact Melissa on 079 881 5106 to secure your spot. University of the Western Cape, driving access to success.
During this challenging year, we have had an overwhelming focus on numbers. The number of cases, the number of recoveries, the number of deaths, the impact on the nation's economy, the worldwide impact of the pandemic, the number of individuals who are in need, and the number of people who have made investments to support that need. Sometimes we can lose the heart of the matter in these numbers. It is that your care and contribution makes a meaningful impact. At least one person stands to benefit from your willingness to make a change. Making an impact is more than just giving money. It has an overwhelming ripple effect to someone that remains nameless and faceless to you. Your contribution means a whole lot more to them. So please pledge your support, no matter how big or small. You may never know how immeasurable the impact will be.
Here we are, a new year, a new decade, and I hope a renewed sense of optimism and determination to make the most of 2020. I am proud to say that this institution has played a pivotal role in my life. I've seen firsthand how it has transformed over the years to become a beacon of hope, a catalyst for positive change, and a vibrant intellectual frontrunner in the academic and social spheres. This is a momentous year for the UWC family as we celebrate our 60th birthday. The start of UWC's journey in 1960 was ill-fated. 166 students destined for lower to mid-level positions at schools, the civil service, and other institutions designated for the colored community. But this tenacious family refused to settle for that. We became an intellectual vanguard for South Africa's historic change. We denounced apartheid, opened the doors of learning to all South Africans, and in 1970, the university gained university status and could award its own degrees and diplomas. There were casualties, but this has made us resilient and innovative. Today, UWC is classified among the foremost higher education institutions on the African continent and has reaped international acclaim for teaching, learning, and research.
And what a glorious, optimistic view that is of academia, of academic life, of life within the campus environment. And I'm sure everybody is gagging to get back to that kind of normality once again. 2020 has been such a hard year for absolutely everybody around the world. And in some countries going back into hard lockdowns again, the prospect of returning to normality is that much further away. Well, today we talk about the future of universities in terms of defining a post-COVID economy. It feels a little bit premature to be talking about post-COVID, but we see increasingly optimistic signs of the possibility of vaccines coming through. Just this week, Aspen Pharmacare has announced that it has done a deal with Johnson & Johnson, the biggest drugs maker in the world, to be its local partner to produce 300 million doses a year. They anticipate, with regulatory approvals, they can have it done by March next year. And after that, you start seeing the global rollouts. Hello, everybody. My name is Bruce Whitfield, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this gathering, this beautiful digital gathering, as we look at the future of universities and we know that universities can play into the future in terms of dealing with the economic catastrophe that has hit so many countries, particularly our own, as a result of lockdowns. Welcome, everybody. Particular welcome to Ms. Patricia Lawrence, Director for Institutional Advancement at the Department for Institutional Advancement at the University of the Western Cape, and to all of you today, including my panelists today. I've got Jodie Lynn Blake, otherwise known as Jo Blake, who is the lead of ABSA's Group Talent Acquisition. She's going to be joining us today. We've also got Dr. Christy Swanepoel. There's Jo Blake. Hello, Jo Blake.
Hi, everyone.
She's enthusiastic. We like that, Jo. Dr. Christy Swanepoel, who is from the University of the Western Cape, a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics, in a lovely bed of students, which is good to see. And Mr. Mani Regal, the Executive Director of Finance and Services, the University Bean Counter. I don't think that's too rude, Mani. I don't think that's too rude. The University Bean Counter. Somebody has to keep tabs on the money. Good to see you. Thank you very much indeed. But before we get there, before we get to the discussions, and by the way, as you know by now, all these webinars, the best thing for you to do to participate in this conversation, please, is to post your questions. We've got the chat box. The chat boxes are open, and would love you to participate in that today, because that is a critical part of the conversation. I have been asked to share with you a couple of observations, maybe some views as to where we are, where we've been, and where we're coming from and going to. And so let me get that underway. I do hope you can see my screen. And I recently, it feels like it was just yesterday, but in March, just the week we went into lockdown, I published a book, well, Pat Macmillan published my book, called The Upside of Down. And it was a critical look at the evolution and development of South Africa over centuries, and looking at the current times that we're in and government intransigence in terms of developing economic policy, the sort of economic policy that is going to make the future brighter for more people. And I was getting increasingly frustrated about it, but at the same time refusing to buy into the narrative that it's all fall down for South Africa. We were headed to a fiscal cliff, we were headed to a crisis long before COVID began, and the book dared to suggest some solutions for the future. And that is what we're trying to do today with what we're doing in the discussion that we are doing. Please welcome Professor Bauer as well. Professor Bauer, welcome. Nice to see you too. And as we take you through this talk, let me just start off with Vladimir Lenin. I thought it would be good to start off with a communist. There are decades when nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. And what a year this has been, because that's precisely how it all played out. This little guy, this nasty little sod, COVID-19, came and disrupted absolutely everything. When I was at Davos at the World Economic Forum in January, and you always know, either when somebody's got an MBA, they say, got an MBA, or they've been to Davos, they say, when I was at Davos, so I apologize for being that guy. But it is relevant to today, because when I was at Davos in January, the world was a very, very different place. I left the office and my office looked a bit like this one. And not long after that, all offices and all campuses around the country looked like this mass evacuation. Because as I was in Davos, people were starting to talk about this virus that was emanating from China. And it was beginning to look really quite terrifying. And it's had a huge negative impact on the world. I mean, for the accountants amongst you, you'll be familiar with accounting terminology, for example, earnings before tax, interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, better known as EBITDA. We're going to have to call it EBITDA because we have to throw Corona into the mix. Coronavirus has disrupted absolutely everything. And when we sit in our really difficult situation, and there's so much misinformation at the moment, and as we have learned in the last couple of days, even what Joseph Goebbels understood in World War II before that when you repeat lies often enough, they become the truth. So there is no greater master, of course, of prevaricating on the outskirts of veracity, which is a fancy way of saying he's a filthy-mouthed liar, than Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has sought to dismay, disrupt, and discombobulate the US election outcome, as it looks increasingly likely that this guy is going to become the next president of the United States. Just how effective he is going to be with what looks like a Republican-dominated Congress, I don't know. But certainly change is good, because what we have seen over certainly the last 4 years of the American presidency is just this acceleration in misinformation, this acceleration in division, this acceleration in trying to make America great again in the context of destroying the planet, just in the context of really undermining what was already in place. And there was this huge shift to the east, and the growth of Asian economies, and this magnificent swell of economic optimism in so many parts of the world, which threatens America's dominance, of course, and something that Donald Trump didn't like very much. Here in South Africa, we had one of the hardest lockdowns in the world, first for 3 weeks and then for 5 weeks. And no sooner did we come out of that, of course, than we had Eskom saying, terribly sorry, but we're not used to keeping the lights on. We'd had very little demand for our electricity. So I know you've had a load, which made it tolerable. Imagine if we had load shedding during lockdown. For adding insult to injury. There's load shed, and for those who are sensitive amongst you, it's a slightly rude word for which I apologize, but I won't utter it. You can close your eyes at this point so you don't see it. If you add in the COVID-19 crisis, if you add in the economic collapse around us and economic contraction this year of 9 or 10%, depending who you listen to, our brains are bursting and we're feeling very, very gloomy about the future. But we've got to be so careful about the stories we listen to. This is one of the most magnificent books written in recent times by Robert Shiller, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist. And the book is called Narrative Economics, and how stories go viral and drive major global events, and economic events. And what Robert Shiller did was he went and analyzed the big trends. I mean, when Donald Trump became president, the Bank of England appointed a person just to monitor Donald Trump's Twitter feeds, because every time he tweeted, there were market reactions. And eventually, I think markets calmed down and came to realize that a lot of what he was saying was complete and utter rubbish. But Robert Shiller is very clear on the sort of narratives we tell ourselves. And for South Africa, for so long, we've been telling ourselves the implosion self-destruct story, and that narrative has taken over, and it's perfectly understandable considering where we've come from the Zuma era, the huge levels of corruption. Day after day, we're seeing the horror stories play out at the Zondo Commission, and we know that we've been robbed blind, and that we as citizens have aided and abetted that by putting certain politicians in power for extended periods of time. So we've only really got ourselves to blame. We can wag fingers at the politicians and shout at them. That's not going to do us any good. What we have to be doing is looking forward and looking for stories to tell that actually improve our own state of mind. We need to start living less on Facebook and on social media and actually reading more broadly, inquiring more broadly about some of the most remarkable stories. And I tell those stories in my book, The Upside of Down, of just some great South African entrepreneurs who for many years, in more recent times, a new generation of bright young entrepreneurs building problem-solving businesses to address some of the many needs that our country faces. It's so hard for us to believe that we're living through the hardest time in human history. It's just patently not true. We are on the cusp of an extraordinary opportunity to turn ourselves around. I know the medium-term budget policy statement read worse than a Stephen King novel on Halloween. Because Stephen King, of course, is the master of horror stories. If you read one of those on Halloween, you won't sleep for months. Tito Mbowene's medium-term budget policy statement was a bit like that. But I'd like to go back to the president's dream of the future, if you like, and his talking about greater public-private sector cooperation, getting the private sector more involved in infrastructure spend, making projects the government wants to spend money on bankable so that money will be invested in these projects rather than government getting all heavy-handed and doing things like prescribed assets and getting really, really difficult about it, because that ultimately is just a one-way spiral downwards. We've got some smart economic managers finally back in charge of the country, and that is a very good place to be. Also, COVID-19, massively disruptive, massively dislocating. We hope that we don't go into another series of lockdowns in South Africa. That was not very good for our national mood, national psyche, and certainly not good for nearly 3 million people who lost their jobs. And unfortunately, in these crises, more often than not, really poor people are those who suffer most. And the state has not been great in terms of its ability to keep the wolf from the door, in terms of making sure that the subsidies that should have got paid. But if we give ourselves a little bit of context and you look back 102 years to the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu, there were 500 million cases worldwide. I mean, this thing ran rampant simply because by the time the world realized there was a problem, it was so widespread that it was uncontrollable. 1 in 3 people alive in the world contracted the Spanish flu. 50 million people died. 50 million people died. Now, I know the global death rate has risen to over 1 million, and that is concerning, of course, and will continue to rise, particularly with the surges we're seeing in infections in places like Europe and the United States, where it's been allowed to run amok, even though the US president himself, the current US president, came down with the virus. And it's been an extraordinary set of circumstances, but we have learned so much in this crisis, not only about ourselves and about humanity, but also about the power of science and technology and what that has done for us to help us survive through this crisis. The most important thing I've learned, and this is a quote often attributed to Mark Twain, politicians and diapers should be changed often and for the same reason, because they're all full of, you know what, trouble. For those of you who are really pessimistic about South Africa, I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up or anything, but I'm curious as to where your mind is. How many recessions has South Africa had in the past 50 years? Now, take your mind back 50 years, for those of you who remember it. The Prof might, a couple of you will. How many recessions has South Africa had in the past 50 years? I'll give you 3 options. If we had 9 recessions, 14 recessions, or even more than that. And just to help you with this, I mean, 50 years is an awfully long time. The 1970s, go back to it. I mean, it was a period of lots of recessions, of lots of contractions, of lots of really difficult times, global world crisis, the Watergate scandal, which destroyed the political career of Richard Nixon. Well, he destroyed his own political career, but let's not get too hung up on details. It was the era of Annelien Kriel, who was Miss World. It was the era of the Rezenkovitz sextuplets, the 6 kids born to Rezenkovitz family. You remember them, I'm sure. It was also the era of the Soweto uprising. It was the era of a great deal of upheaval in South Africa. As Black South Africans, marginalized for 300 and something years, stood up and just went, you know what, this far and no further. No, thank you very much. It's a time where UWC was in its infancy, of course, finding its way in the world and becoming a bastion for rebellion against apartheid. But it was during this era, of course, of massive economic turmoil, huge inflation pressure in South Africa. We get to the 1980s, the era of P.W. Botha, the era of huge suppression, states of emergency and long periods of recession. Get to the early 1990s, and we have one that feels like one huge long recession. It was a dreadful time, dreadful time. It may surprise you that we've had just 9 recessions over that time. And of course, since 1994, it's slightly tricky for you. How many of those recessions have occurred since 1994? 2, 5, 7, 8? How many have we had? We only really had 2. If you take a recession as a full year of economic contraction, the first one was in 2009, and the economy contracted by 2%. And it was because of the global financial crisis, actually through no fault of our own. We were doing fine, okay, other than running out of electricity, which was a massive own goal back then. But the global financial crisis really hit us hard. And the next recession is happening right now. And this one, again, is more our fault. Well, the depth of it and extent of it and the duration of it and how we're going to recover from it is our fault. And how we recover it is our responsibility, frankly, and that's what part of today's conversation is all about, and what universities can do to play that role. We've only had 2 recessions. People are very critical of government and its economic management. In fact, it was Trevor Manuel and the ANC that took South Africa out of recession and restored South Africa's investment grade rating. And by 2008, we were in fine shape. We were creating jobs. The economy was growing. It was fine. I mean, we dropped lots of balls on HIV and AIDS, and let's, we can get caught up in the detail of that. But economically, South Africa was flourishing. And then we went into what we call the lost decade. And South Africa truly not only lost that decade, but there's a huge risk of losing this decade and subsequent decades unless we act to restore South Africa's economic dignity, prowess, and ability to help alleviate some of the country's biggest problems. But so often, as Hans Rosling, the great statistician, put it, as humans, we have an overdramatic worldview. We often think the worst, and in fact, the worst actually very seldom happens. Imagine if this crisis had struck in the era of the Nokia 3310, a wonderful device for making phone calls and playing Snake, but not much good at connecting you to the real world. Imagine in the era of the dial-up modem had this crisis happened. It's happened in an era of broadband and greater connectivity than ever before, which has enabled you to keep delivering lessons. It's enabled everybody to keep, well, except pilots and builders and people who do proper, who do physical work. And for those of us in the white collar skills economy, we've been able, by and large, to continue. As Satya Nadella, the chief executive of Microsoft, puts it, we've seen 2 years of digital transformation in just 2 months. I talked to CEOs of South African companies. They're chucked away the next 5 years of business plans and are sort of digging up plans for 2026 and beyond because things have evolved so fast. We've learned that science matters, and thank goodness Americans appear to have learned this as well, or at least enough to understand that science does matter and investment in science matters. And scientists matter, mathematicians matter, because technology matters. And we're seeing a huge ramp up in the uses of technologies. We're going to see an exponential increase in the uses of technologies. And this is where you guys come in and the role that you can play into the future. We've also learned, so importantly, that leadership matters. And I'm sorry if I offend anybody politically, but I actually don't care. I care that I've upset you. I don't care that I'm saying upsetting things. Understand what I mean? But just imagine for a moment, just for one moment, that this guy had been in charge of the country at this time. And then you thank your lucky stars and you think, hold on a second, there is an upside of down. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it's difficult, but at least we've got some economic sensibility in charge of the moment. We never let a good crisis go to waste. Rahm Emanuel, who was Barack Obama's chief of staff, he was the mayor of Chicago for a while as well. And all we can hope that government really understands, and the breadth of government, certainly the top tiers of government, I think we get a very clear picture of an understanding of the level of the crisis we're in. But at the same time, it needs to filter down. It needs to go through the layers of government, through the trade union movement, through civil society, through business, that there has to be a collaboration like we've never seen before. Because you can be an optimist and you can see the glass half full. You can be a pessimist and see the glass half empty. Or you can be a realist and just go, you know what, it's not very good liquid, this, I don't like it, but it's the liquid that I've got. And I have to filter it a little, but if that's all I've got to drink, I'm going to drink it, because those are the cards that we've been dealt for this decade, and we have to make it work. As Thomas Edison once said, opportunity is missed by everyone because comes dressed in overalls and it looks like work. We've got a very hard decade ahead of us, a hard number of years where we're going to have to work harder than ever before to restore South Africa's economic dignity. But please, as we do this, we need to focus on facts. We need to focus on understanding that there is so much noise and dissemination of false information around, and that if we're truly going to work together to improve the future, we need to take these words of Abraham Lincoln. And I know that this is a true fact. Earlier, I wasn't sure about the Mark Twain one, but I know this comes from Abraham Lincoln because I found it on the internet. That is, don't believe everything you read on the internet. Please do not, because that is so often a distraction, a noise. And I think what we've learned in the last little while is that we need to be very, very particular about what we consume from an information perspective, because that certainly will affect our ability to grow into the future. Let's get into a discussion now about the state of play, because I think that's an important state of play. And I think it is important today to have this conversation. And I'm curious to start about the economic impact on higher education of what we're seeing at the moment. And I'd like to call, maybe first, who do I call on first? I think Ahmed Bauer, maybe we do that. Let's call on you, Prof, because from your perspective, please, I'm really curious to know how you see government's choices when it comes to the way in which it's apportioning money. Throwing money, for example, after SAA and taking money from government departments, and how the role of government and the threat, of course, to NSFAS funding and all of these sorts of things. Give me a sense of the funding picture, if you would, Prof.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you so much for that introduction. I mean, I think it was really fun and enjoyed that very much. But, look, there were 3 or 4 things that really threw the university system in this year. I mean, well, clearly COVID-19 almost led us into a level of paralysis. And I think, you know, when we look back at this year, I think we'll all have to just stand back and think about how resilient our universities are and the extent to which they kind of pull together, if you like, to, you know, to make good this year. But having said that, there's no question about the fact that there's a short-term financial crisis, which due to kind of huge expenses in the areas of online sort of remote learning, massive investments in preparing campuses for safety, and then cut in subsidy, and then finally just student bad debt. And then, of course, there were losses due to kind of cuts in financial income from financial investments and all of that. Perhaps most importantly, you know, what seems to be a longer-term challenge is the issue around the cuts to the research enterprise, and and we are deeply worried about that. Having said that, what's of even more concern now is kind of what we would think about as a kind of medium to long-term sustainability. Because as you're seeing, government is moving money around, understandably, I guess, but at the same time, what we are grappling with now are not just the short-term implications of the COVID-19, but the long-term implications on the levels of subsidy, the levels of student funding, levels of funding for students, investment in research, investment in infrastructure, all of that. I mean, so I think that the university sector is in for fairly difficult 3 or 4 years, or even longer. And it opens up, the need for us now to be much more much more innovative and bullish and so on about looking at alternative forms of funding, alternative routes of generating income and so on. Because what is clear is that the level of stability that we were hoping for in terms of funding is just not going to be there. And one of the dangers that we face, and we've said this to government over and over again, that if scientific activities, and I don't mean science in a narrow fashion, but science broadly speaking as knowledge and so on, knowledge production and so on, that once you break a chain, it's very, very difficult to put it together again. And I have a story from particle physics, if we have some time later on to just explain.
Why don't I pause you there, because that's a lovely cliffhanger. I love a good story from particle physics. I'll pick up on that story in just a moment. Prof, thank you very much for contextualizing it, because that's the first part of today's conversation. The chat box is open. You ask questions. A couple of those have come through. We'll get to those questions. But more of this discussion around the funding of universities. It's a big issue. We'll kick it off in a moment with the Prof's story on particle physics. In the meantime, I'm going to Google particle physics. Back in a moment. It's a really fabulous opportunity today to talk about the crisis in funding for higher education institutions. And then later on in that context, how we make it work, because it's only going to be a limited amount of cloth. We're going to have to cut our patterns very carefully and select how we work. But Prof, before we get on to the rest of our panelists, a good story on particle physics can never go unheard.
Okay, so, there are two big branches in particle physics, theoretical particle physics, and then there are these huge accelerators, like the one at CERN in Geneva, where these particle beams collide into each other and at very close to the speed of light. And then you recreate conditions that were very similar to the conditions that existed at the time of the Big Bang. And then you can study that and therefore study what happened very close to the Big Bang. Now, the story I wanted to tell was that, although the cost of these colliders are really measured in terms of percentages of GDP, I mean, that's how expensive they are. The one thing that will never happen is that that scientific community will not allow an accelerator project not to be occurring between periods of optimum operation. And the reason for that is if you lose the momentum in terms of the number of people who are working on accelerator physics, if you lose that momentum, it'll be next to impossible to recreate it. But that's true for many branches of research and innovation. And so it's critically important that our government sees investment in research and investment in higher education as really an investment in our future, rather than just see it as an expenditure item on the MTEF and so on.
Yeah, I think in as much as we've come to learn that science is important, technology is important, education is the basis of that, not only at university level, but of course all the way through the education system, all the way through the education system from the bottom up, whether it be from preschool to grade 1. Let's bring in here, please. I'd like to bring Dr. Christy Swanepoel in here. We haven't heard Dr. Christy's voice yet. How did you respond, Christy Swanepoel, to this crisis? What was your first, other than running around screaming like we all did and buying what was left of the toilet paper, what was your response? Off mute, please, Christy. I love this. This is my favorite word of my favorite phrase of 2020. Off mute, please, Christy.
Yes. So I thought I did off mute. So obviously my computer has a bit of a delay. But yes, so no, the biggest impact for me, of course, was moving to online teaching. I was lucky in that regard. In the first semester, I had a mathematical economics course that I offered. And in that course, I decided to experiment a bit with flipped classrooms, where you have the students do the work outside of the classrooms, and then you just do your examples or discussions in your lecture venue. So what I did is to create videos for this flipped classroom experiment of mine. And then we were in the last week of term 1 when COVID happened, and luckily I could then just continue with that classroom experiment. So it worked well. What I don't like about the online teaching part is feedback and marking. It takes much longer than other times, and I want to say normal times, but it does take much longer. So you have to adjust. So instead of giving individual feedback to students on their scripts, you would rather give overall feedback. So students got this wrong, or students did this where they should have done this. So we adjusted like that. And then I felt I had a bit more time for research. And then the drawback on that again was the archives were closed. So I'm not just an economist, I'm an economic historian. So I tend to look at things over a very long period of time. So I told my students in 100 years, economic historians are going to look back at COVID and maybe look at the impact on investment in green energy, for example. So how did different countries respond to green investment given the experience of COVID, if I can put it.
And I love that economic history perspective, Christy, because I mean, if we go through economic history, we see the huge dislocations that happen at massive moments in world history, whether you go back to World War I and the impact of that, immediately followed by the Spanish flu, immediately followed by the Great Depression, by then the boom of the 50s and 60s. And certainly from a Western perspective, Vietnam was a big dislocator. The oil crisis affected the entire world. And in each one of these instances, we've had nations make pivotal decisions about their futures. They've chosen governments that have taken actions. They've made decisions about the future. And future historians are going to look back at this time now and are going to judge us, I think, very harshly on the decisions we make when it comes to the environment, when it comes to climate, when it comes to poverty, when it comes to how we get ourselves out of this mess. Because the crisis itself is actually not the crisis. The crisis is the future, and that is determined by our actions. If I'm not getting too Donald Rumsfeldy and a bit chaotic in my question.
Yes, no, I agree with that sentiment. And I think how you respond to crisis links back to the professor's point about where you shift your momentum to. And momentum can carry you for a very long period of time. So if you make the right decisions now, you can have a very long period that you ride that kind of wave of good decision making. The Chinese and most of the Southeast Asian countries we now know are already economically recovering in 2020. So how do they achieve that? How do they do that? And I recently read an article on the Guardian website where he makes this point that an important aspect of these Southeast Asian countries is social cohesion, that it's just they all believe in the better of the community and not just focusing on myself. And I think that's an important part of how we're going to recover and how we're going to make our decisions. We see that in the Western countries, we have protests because I don't want any limitations on my individual freedoms. And now we see where if you go through a period of pain, like most East Asian countries, but we all decide for the better of the good, we do this, then you can recover quite quickly.
And you don't get videos of people in China going into Walmarts and getting into fisticuffs over wearing masks and stuff and looking to buy guns and bullets and all that sort of crazy stuff. It's just, it's lovely. Thank you for that contribution, Christy. Marnie Regal, who is Executive Director of Finance and Services at UWC. From a university perspective, I mean, huge pressure, of course, because so many students simply don't have the means to do remote learning, don't have the ability to get the broadband, to get the devices. How did the university cope financially when it came to this very, very hard and sustained lockdown?
Yes, thank you for that. I think it first came with resistance from many students, where I think there was just the fact that one had to destigmatize the online learning processes. So it was difficult for institutions to transform overnight into the online learning processes. And if you had a learning management system currently in force, it would have been much easier. So there were many institutions that is still struggling up till today to actually get it to work. And so the issue goes back to access. And it's all about how does one access online learning when you do not have the funds available for your student device or for data. And the way UWC has dealt with it is that we had to procure devices overnight during a period of lockdown where it was we also learned through that experience that all the devices in South Africa has already been sold off. So we had to go through a rigorous process of procurement to actually source the devices from overseas, where somebody may have had it stacked up in a warehouse. And the way the funding model worked was that the university would finance the device on behalf of the student, but we would still require the student to pay for the device. And for that, we were vilified in social media. It's with great difficulty that the just general communities would expect them to pay for a device when it would be expected or by perception that the university should just pay for it. So it was a very interesting dynamic to this. Social media wasn't kind to the institution because of that particular scheme of bringing the devices and having it delivered to your home and so on.
Did you learn any important lessons there in terms of how seriously you take that noise? I mean, it's personal and everyone's under pressure, and you've got young, very socially media agile individuals who are very grumpy at you and the institution. Did you learn to block it out? Did you engage with it? How did you deal with the fallout?
Yeah, there was very little time for engagement because everything had to happen on the pulse. We had to take very bold decisions, and one of the criteria that drove this decision was that we can ill afford to finance student devices from institutional funds, or else we would have to fund it through a retrenchment program, or we would have to destabilize the finances in order to fund the devices. And how would one prove true indigence if a student had to make application for a device where they already have a device? So if a device was free, then everybody would make application.
Absolutely.
And I'm just generalizing, but that's just the way the world works. And we thought that the most fiscal discipline process would be that we have to finance the equipment, but then have the students to actually pay for it. And for that, it didn't go down very well with the institution, nor the student or the community.
Look, it was never going to be easy. It was always going to be complicated. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, so the flip side to it is that we did have a fundraising campaign. It was the hashtag "No Student Will Be Left Behind," and we were criticized for that too. Where we did indeed raise successfully enough funds to pay for the devices, but we found that the devices were becoming a moving target. So the more the more students got to know about the fundraising campaign, the more students started making application. And for many of them, it was on the basis that they could not afford for it, and now that they know that it could be funded, they would make application. So it was just a balancing act of being disciplined with our finances, but at the same time to be socially sensitive to the plight of our student profile. And then there was the issue of data. So now that you have the machine, now that you have a student device, who's going to pay for the data? And again, the institution had to come up with a plan by raising funds and so on. And the National Student Financial Aid Scheme also came up with some solutions to that. So I think what in retrospect, what would have worked much better was if we knew this was going to happen, what kind of plan would we put in place? And the plan that we wouldn't put in place is the actual plan that we have implemented because we thought that we was fiscally responsible. And so that was the decision-making processes, and I think that is what steered us to in a very long, on a good path. And also there's the fact that other institutions at that very time were going on the loan scheme, and the loan scheme is effectively that the student device is free. It's at no cost for use. All you have to do is return the device in 3 years' time. And I have warned those institutions that in 3 years' time, when that machine comes back, it's going to be obsolete. Nobody's going to want it. So you'll be stacking up on these devices in a warehouse and perhaps having to donate it to an outside party. So there were many moving parts to it, but I think the driving force was that we had to balance all our decisions to make sure that from a collective perspective, that finances are included in this, as because that our decisions for short term will have an impact long term, and that's what effectively drove it.
And absolutely, Mani, thank you very much indeed. I see Christy and Prof. Ahmed Bawa have been responding to a very good question from Ian, which if you're not on the chat box, you would have missed. And Ian's point was that universities need to move from online teaching to online learning. And while it might sound like two sides of the same coin, Prof. Ahmed Bawa, it's a fundamentally different proposition, isn't it? I mean, learning online and teaching online, you transpose the classroom onto the internet, that's hard. And there's a big evolution that has to happen, and it could be a wonderful innovation that actually helps the sustainability of South African institutions. Unmute, please, Prof. There we go.
Yeah, I think it is a vital question. You know, the idea of using technology for technology's sake is a crazy one. So the question is really, can we find ways of improving the quality of teaching and learning through the innovative use of technology? And clearly there are other purposes, of course, broadening access and so on. But for example, I mean, we are all talking about the shift from face-to-face to blended learning and so on, and that's all well and good. The question really is, does it improve the quality of learning and teaching? Then there's the other side, which is that what technology might be fantastic for in terms of today's discussion is just the issue, the whole issue around having an effective lifelong learning system in place. Just the idea that once somebody has got a qualification, that they can dip in and dip out of the education system as and when required. And that's, technology makes that possible. But Bruce also wanted to say that, that we have to be really careful that, that there's still the need for us to bring students together with professors if we want to create organic intellectuals, and if we want to create young engaged citizens and all of that. So I'm not one of these people who think that that this disruption is going to lead to the destruction of the university as an institution. I'm not in that space. Maybe I'm too old, but I'm not in that space.
No, but I hear what you're saying, and Christy Swanepoel, I'm sure you've seen it certainly in the corporate sector, and Joe, may come to you in a moment as well. But just how similar the massive upheaval was in businesses, how massively upheaval it is in what the future of the world of work looks like. We're still debating this issue. It was going to be the death of the office. Nobody was ever going to go back to offices again. And then people's husbands and wives threw their spouses out of the house and told them, please, to go back to the office. And kids wanted to go back to school and students want to go back to university. So I think we've over-exaggerated just the dramatic nature of this shift. But Christy, it's wonderful. Do you agree that this allows us to hybridize certainly the work environment and education too?
Yes, no, I think it definitely does change how you need to think about education and how to use education. So what's going to happen with, I want to say, traditional lectures? I predict in a couple of years that's not going to exist anymore. You won't have a lecturer standing in front of a venue with 200 students in the venue and saying, this is what microeconomics is about, go back to your textbook and study it. You have to also think about the skills that you teach your students. What are they going to need to be active citizens, to be an active labor force participant, and to actually be employable? So we need to reconfigure how we think about what we teach our students. So Ian's point about computational, I want to get this right, computational thinking, I do think there's a part of that in this whole narrative and how we change, how we adjust to crises, how we use technology. So like Prof said, don't just use technology for technology's sake, it has to actually have a point. So if I think back to my courses, whenever I want to set an assessment, I think about how will this translate to the student if they enter the labor force. So they should be able to read an article or a budget speech or whatever and summarize it for their boss in a couple of pages maybe. They should be able to present the summary statistics. They should be able to make a PowerPoint presentation and say, this is what's important out of this report. So how do we use that technology then to teach these skills that are actually applicable to the labor force?
And it's a lovely point to pause. Thank you, Christy. It's wonderful, because in a moment, I'm going to come back to Joe Blake. Now, Joe is the lead for group talent acquisition at ABSA. And the world has changed fundamentally, not only from an education perspective, from a workplace perspective too, Joe Blake. That question to you on what you're looking for and what universities can do to serve your needs in a moment.
The University of the Western Cape is celebrating 60 years of hope to action through knowledge by hosting a 60-for-60 golf fundraiser challenge to support the education and development of 60 deserving UWC students. Show your support by entering a 4-ball or by contributing to a watering hole and prizes. Tee-off is at 11 a.m. on Thursday, 12 November at the King David Golf Club in Mowbray. Contact Melissa on 079 881 5106 to secure your spot. Univip, driving access to success.
Access to success. What are you looking for, Joe Blake at ABSA? As you look at this way the world has changed so suddenly, 12 months ago, you probably would have been looking for different skills coming out of a UWC than you're looking for in 2021 and beyond.
Absolutely, Bruce. I think that just reflecting on the experience of COVID and even in a personal context, how that impacted me. Mother of two, sitting at home, never in my wildest dreams did I ever think that I'd be able to actually manage a full-time career while actually doing online learning with a 4 and a 10-year-old. Having said that though, just on reflecting, if I looked at my 10-year-old and the skills that she picked up in just that short period of time where she was accessing online learning to kind of get through grade 4, she's now thinking so differently. And I think in the world of work and the skills that we're looking for future, you're not necessarily going to find them in textbooks. When you think in the context of 4IR, we're looking for critical thinkers, we're looking for innovators, we're looking for that creative ability. And I think that's a little bit hard to do because it's more softer skills. And for me, I think the gap that's going to be bridged, or how we can assist in bridging that gap, is around aligning sort of what is industry looking for and how is, from a university perspective, that aligned to curriculum. And I think for business, we've got to be agile, right? We've got to be on our toes. We've got to be able to react to change really quickly. But at the same time, we've got to keep in context. So what are the students doing? I mean, at the end of the day, that's going to impact employability. It's going to impact on our economy as a society and a country. So definitely that's kind of where we positioned in terms of what we're looking for. So key things like commercial awareness, leadership. I think even in the context of emotional sort of intelligence and EQ, there's a big focus on that in the world of work. And as much as people are sitting with this, kind of half fear of, oh gosh, robots and technology is going to take over my world and my life, I think it's also important to look at the human aspects and how important that is in the context of actually fusing and almost blending how technology can make you more efficient and can in adding more value in terms of your role, as opposed to kind of it taking over. Because I don't think that human aspect of judgment, leadership, networking, communication, all of those kind of integral human skills is really where our key focus is at the minute.
Thank you, Joe. I mean, Prof. Bauer, it's what struck me there, and it's resonated so strongly with me because I've got similar age gaps, kids sitting at home with devices, and when they weren't Minecraft during lessons, they were actually doing some learning. But it's fundamentally shifting the way your pipeline across all universities, your pipeline of fellow students is growing, and actually the need for universities to evolve to what the next generation of students are, how they get to operate. And that's quite an important evolution, and why it's important that so many of the learnings that you've had this year are actually accelerated for the next decades with students.
I think that's a really good point. And by the way, several universities are reporting that the interim performance of students in preparations for the exams, so all the tests and half-year exams and all of that, are reporting. Several universities are reporting that students have performed better this year. Now that sounds a bit crazy, but
no, they weren't having fun. They weren't socializing. They weren't sitting on the library steps. They were in the virtual library.
Right.
So actually didn't work for once. I mean, I wish that when I was at university.
So I think that it is an important point that is being raised. We have two grandchildren, one 9 and one 11, and the younger one, the 9-year-old, said to us the other day, she doesn't understand why he doesn't understand why he has to go to school. I mean, everything the teacher wants to know, I can just Google. That's what he actually said. So using Google as a verb. So I think that there is a change coming down the line, and one of the challenges our universities are going to face is to understand how academics can adjust to this new environment. That young people are going to come with it. But it does raise another question, and it's the one that Mani referred to some extent, which is that, if I was the minister, if I was the president now, and I'm not, and I don't want to be, but if I was the president, I would, my major project now for education would be to create a national digital teaching and learning ecosystem, which is available to everybody in the country, all institutions. That will be a major investment, in the future of our country. Mani referred to the data cost, but just to give you a little hint of, by the way, fought day and night with every one of those mobile network operators because they were refusing to come to the party, right, to bring down their prices. It was a constant fight. And it seems to me that there is a need for a national platform, so that we don't exacerbate the inequalities in our system, we don't, all those kinds of things. And just one last point, and that is that, one of the things that we've been kind of really focused on in this last period of time is trying to just galvanize, government, private sector, and so on, to understanding that we are all in this together, that this is not something that's going to be resolved by the universities. It's not something that's going to be we all have the need to work together. So the idea of partnerships is fundamental. And I can also mention, like, quite categorically, and Mani will agree with me, that at USAF, at least at University of South Africa, this year, there was a sea change in the sense that the 26 universities and the Department of Higher Education Training, Council on Higher Education, we all came together and we said, we've got to work together to solve this, to resolve the challenges we face. And it worked, it worked well.
I get that so much from so many CEOs, and particularly in the health sector, for example, in the early days of this crisis, collaboration between the Department of Health and private hospitals, just the sense of, okay, the Titanic is, they said the iceberg, it's taking on water, we better start working on a solution quickly. And I think that was very effective. Mani, do you want to add to what the Prof has just been saying in terms of that collaborative aspect before I go to Christy Swanepoel?
Absolutely. Firstly, I never disagree with the professor, but we have never seen a type of partnership as we see now. Never before did the Finance Executive Forum, which is a community of practice of all the CFOs of nationwide, sit together in the same boardroom with all the vice chancellors of institutions, where we make aware, we're sharing information. And it was just the best thing that could have happened was for us to do that and have some form of sectoral approach so that we're all on the same page and we can learn from each other. And what we've also learned is that the government departments can work with us. The Department of Higher Education and Training was a true partner in this relationship, in making things better. In assisting with even regulations and coming up with new gazetted documents, which was something that was almost impossible in the past. It happens overnight, so it can be done. So we saw new efficiencies, new inspirations, new partnerships, and it was just the most wonderful experience. And we're hoping that that we can continue this way. And it would be very sad to see that if we go back to the way we used to be, and I'm now also referring to the way we're teaching and learning is currently being carried over. If we go back to the ways of old, it would be most sad because we have now remodeled into a flexible or multimodal teaching and learning approach, where we are busy reconfiguring our financial systems, our budgets, to accommodate this new form of discourse and teaching medium. So why would we go back when this is actually working?
I pity people who want to go back to what they regard as normal. Oh, I can't wait to go back to normal. Normal was rubbish. Normal was hours in traffic and on aeroplanes and just destroying the planet one flight at a time. I mean, it was a mess. This is far better. Christy Swanepoel, we need to get to the nub of the topic, and that is, how do institutions of higher learning, how do universities, how does UWC contribute to this enormously difficult road ahead? And it is difficult. There's no finessing this. I mean, we've got huge vested interests in our economy. You keep disappearing, Chris. Your background keeps swallowing you up, but you're back. How do universities, how do they even lead the way? So often at times of crisis, universities is precisely the place where rejuvenation and regeneration often happens.
So I think when I was preparing for today's talk as well, I kept thinking, and to Prof. Bawa's point now as well, why should children go to school? For me, a big part of going to school, I don't have kids, so I'm not an expert, but the social aspect. So
that's why
now,
you look so young and so healthy and so happy and relaxed. That's why.
Yes, probably. That's part of it. So we now have this virtual, we're all in our own bubble at home. We don't interact. We don't see a lot of people. We don't rely so much on the social skills that we learn from being young and active at school and just playing around. And I was also thinking about, there's a lot of focus now on the science and how this virus acts, how this virus attacks the human body, and we don't know enough yet the vaccine development is taking so long. Everyone's getting antsy. When's the vaccine coming? But the other aspect that came to my mind was also the philosophy aspect of how do we respond as humans. We see more and more, especially abroad. I haven't seen as much reporting here, but people dying alone. How do we cope with people dying alone as a society? And how do we respond to that? So we need philosophers for that. We need also sociologists for that. We need, again, back to social cohesion, we need to be able to support each other. But how do universities respond? I want to say there's usually 3 channels through which universities respond. We provide the skills necessary. We get, so skill development patterns, the vaccine's not going to come from non-university employees, I want to guess and predict. But also you have universities that, besides these skills, you have the networks that they develop that then provide support. So they need to know each other to be able to connect with each other and then rely on each other.
I hope that's your signal and not my losing signal, but we've started seeing you disintegrate a little bit, but thank you for that. Joe Blake, I have been to many events and many gatherings in the olden days where people would throw out this idea of the 4th Industrial Revolution. The world's coming to an end. It's okay, we'll have the 4th Industrial Revolution and, we'll fix it with technology. And I think what we've learned is the wonderful collaborative power of technology and how it enhances what we do and how it can do so much boring stuff and how it makes everything that we do better. But I just think we've had some really good wake-ups in terms of what the future looks like, in terms of the skills we're going to need, how we're going to access those skills, and how we're going to work into the future. Can you elaborate on that for me a bit, and from the real world of
I think I've lost you there, Bruce, but I'm going to take a stab anyway. I hope my signal's sufficiently stable. I think that just in terms of, if I had to look at corporate South Africa and aligning that more to kind of what's being pushed out from a university curriculum, I see this huge trend and opportunity for universities and corporate SA to work even more closely together in aligning what the curriculum is that's sitting in the universities at the minute. I know there's an ever-changing landscape. I spoke about that earlier. Skills are changing, but I'm noticing there's a growing trend where corporate SA is actually keen to understand and sponsor and get involved in either giving opportunity for students to get involved in actual business problems and solving them within the context of corporate SA. So vocational experience where we can actually equip students for the world of work, that's key for me. And I think then also ensuring that there's closer alignment in terms of what universities are pushing out from a curriculum perspective with regards to what we're dealing with in the real world. And I see huge opportunity there for alignment. That would be a win-win almost situation for both corporate SA, who's receiving the students into the world of work, and obviously the universities at large.
How can universities be better at what they do to serve what you need in the world of work?
I think for me, Bruce, and this is deeply personal, I have a deep, deep passion for youth and sort of youth and young development in terms of the career aspect of things, hence my whole career in talent acquisition. But what immediately springs to mind is, and I know Christy touched on it earlier, you touched on it as well, we're living in a world where we are constantly almost immersed in this promotion of self and just thinking of me. And I really think that in the context of university, students need to learn skills around financial savviness, number one. And it sounds strange, but I think that when you leave university, you don't think of yourself holistically in the bigger, broader scheme of things. Students go, oh, I need a job because I've got either student debt to pay off, or I've got, black tax, or whatever the case may be is. But you go in with this one kind of mindset. And I think really you've got to look at yourself and what's your contribution in the bigger scheme of things. So outside of just, an end to a means. It's about what can I do for my country that's in my control. And I think a lot of the time we don't have that mindset. I do think universities and students at large are so afraid, not universities rather, but there's a lot of students that I've engaged with who have a desire to be entrepreneurs, but they're so afraid of what does that world look like? Is there opportunity within the university context to even maybe adapt programs and help students learn those types of skills? Because I think for me, it's about ensuring that we have a more employable workforce, and that's a better, I suppose, economic prosperity for all of us in general as a country. So I think universities do play a key role in terms of culture, in terms of mindset. How do students show up in the world of work? And of course, corporate SA can also do, a whole host of things. I mean, for example, in the ABS context, we've got work readiness programs. I know of other corporates in SA who do similar. So I do think it's about a paradigm shift in that you are not just Joe Blake serving your own purpose, but really how can I talk to that social cohesion that Christy spoke about earlier in coming together and in my control, what's in my control, how can I impact my society to improve it at large?
Thank you. Christy Swanepoel, I mean, education institutions always often, not always, often criticized as being stuck in the dark ages. They're teaching history rather than the future. Are universities fit for purpose for this new era? I mean, things have moved so fast, as Satya Nadella says, as chief executives tell me all the time, that everybody is sort of like building the road as they're running down it and have to build faster and faster as things move more and more quickly. Are universities, in your opinion, fit for purpose? And I'll ask Prof. Bauer this question as well.
In my opinion, yes. I'm very optimistic that we can adapt in this way. I think universities have also been in this crisis mode. So we just had to adapt immediately. And there's been a lot of discussion about how are we taking this forward. I'm definitely still going to rely on what I have been teaching, the videos that I've made. Let the students rather watch the videos at home on their own time, and when they are in the lecture, just to have discussions and just to talk about what is it that they actually learned. What do they want to know more about? What do they want to discuss more? So I think, yes, even though we were in the crisis mode in 2020, looking to the future, we can definitely play this big critical role.
Prof. Bauer, do you concur? I mean, I suppose you have to. You're speaking your own. We've all got vested interests in academia. But, could universities be doing things better?
Yes, no, look, I mean, I think that we have to think about universities as kind of social institutions, that they're not sort of artifacts of history that kind of just say that they really are tied to kind of the developments in kind of the social political environment and the economic environment and so on. And I think it's a misnomer, that universities are just simply kind of carry on what they've been doing like 50 years ago, whatever the case is. Although I have to say, Physics 1 course may not have changed that much like over those years. But there were two things that came up, during COVID-19, which I think are worthwhile reflecting on. The first one was just the response of universities in the teaching and learning terrain. I mean, just the way in which they responded to the crisis. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that they did a brilliant job and so on, but with the limited resources that were available, I mean, they really did galvanize their capacity and so on to make these big changes that were required. But there was something else, which is largely slipped under the horizon, if you like. It's the kind of the huge repurposing of research, innovation, manufacturing, and so on. I mean, so a whole range of universities, especially the universities of technology, which had advanced additive manufacturing capacity, suddenly switched over to producing, PPEs and ventilators and parts of ventilators and so on and so forth. So just a kind of repurposing of those laboratories. Then, of course, the huge capacity that had been developed around HIV/AIDS was repurposed, if you like, at very short notice to deal with the current pandemic, if you like. Of course, there's all the vaccine testing going on. There's drug, new therapeutics being tested. Mathematicians kind of quickly shifted over into modeling of pandemics and so on. So there's an indication there, that when society calls, there's a capacity for universities to repurpose, to reshape, to move into new domains, if you like. And it seems to me, at least, that that's a lesson to be learned. That as the government publishes these very big programs of economic recovery and so on, there does need to be a greater articulation between those plans and what capacities are available at our universities, and how to bring those together to some extent, at least. And of course, it requires money. So that's the other part of the mix, if you like. So it seems to me that there is a challenge for us to try and understand how to articulate what goes on in universities much more effectively with the grand challenges facing our society. One other thing I think we should all be paying attention to, it seems to be all 26 universities. The one thing we should be paying attention to is to refocus on our students, kind of really redesign our institutions for student development. I don't want to sound unkind, but when I arrived at Durban University of Technology, the students were so angry. I mean, but partly it had to do with the kind of the environment in which they were in. It's a tough environment. And by the way, Durban University of Technology is in the middle of, it's in the middle of the Warwick Junction in Durban, which is like in most countries, it's like a war zone. So it really is about saying, can we refocus our attention on students and focus on their overall development, their intellectual development and their social development and their emotional development, and galvanize the capacity of our universities to make the university experience a telling experience of growth and development and so on. Thanks.
And it's in our own best interest too, Prof, because they're going to be paying for our pensions one day. So we need to make sure that they are absolutely fit for purpose. Prof, thank you for that. I was going to ask you for a closing thought, but I think that is a lovely closing thought with which to leave you. Thank you, Prof. Bauer. John, take a closing thought from you, please. 30 seconds. Let's see if you can.
Sure, Bruce. Just for me, I think biggest standout is gone are the days where you're almost one person at work and another at home. There's such a fusion and a blend just holistically as who you are and how you show up. And I think that more focus and attention needs to be around resilience, the aspects around how to show up, and just that evidence for EQ and assisting students to really get prepared for what it is that they can expect, whether it's a virtual environment or not. And that's just it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Christy Swanepoel, and then Mani Regal, you'll go last. Christy Swanepoel.
Yes, so I'll just echo what Joe said. We need to work together to solve this and to make a stable future for our students and the future generations that will follow.
Mani Regal, will you be able to pay for it? Will we be able to afford that future?
Absolutely. I think to conclude from my side is we do have resources. It is about spending the resources wisely. It's about being responsible to make sure that we set the foundation for the future and for the new type of delivery of higher education. And I don't want to limit it to higher education, but I think it will filter its way down to the schooling system. But we have a responsibility because we do have resources. We must take a sectoral approach. We must embrace an academic restructure. Embrace the uncertainty, because that's the only thing that's certain now for us is the uncertainty that goes with it. and allow for a further outreach to bring more in for access to higher education or post-school education. That's what online can deliver for us, is to have a further reach, bring them in, so that we can have the genius of this country to be exploited through this higher education system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mani, and I love the passion with which you wrap it all up for us today. Prof, thank you very much. Mani Regal, thank you very much. Christy Swanepoel, Joe Blake, thank you very much. To everybody who's tuned in today, thank you very much for giving us your time. We hope that you found that helpful, informative, and useful. And again, to the Department of Institutional Advancement at UWC, thank you very much for making this possible today, and for all of the people in the background, of course, who did all the hard work of making sure that this happened. Thank you very much to you as well. And as for the rest of you, this economy is not going to fix itself. Go and do some work. Well, that means log off here and go back to what you were doing before you logged on here. It's a wonderful new world. Cheers, everyone.
We have had an overwhelming focus on numbers. The number of cases, the number of recoveries, the number of deaths, the impact on the nation's economy, the worldwide impact of the pandemic, the number of individuals who are in need, and the number of people who have made investments to support that need. Sometimes we can lose the heart of the matter in these numbers. What is at the heart? It is that your care and contribution makes a meaningful impact. At least one person stands to benefit from your willingness to make a change. Making an impact is more than just giving money. It has an overwhelming ripple effect to someone that remains nameless and faceless to you. Your contribution means a whole lot more to them. So please pledge your support, no matter how big or small. You may never know how immeasurable the impact will be.